All right. Now, another huge category where I do have plenty of updates for all of you regards standardized testing. Yes, there are a lot of updates going on in the realm of standardized testing, which I found out about for NACAC. Fortunately, I was able to talk to people from College Board and also representatives from the ACT to keep you up to date on these changes. So the first thing are test optional policies. So is test optional still a thing? Well, the short answer is yes, very much so, and I would say it's here to stay. Okay, so based on a couple of sessions that I attended at the NACAC conference, there's some takeaways here. Several of the schools have indeed affirmed that for their institutional research, they found that, hey, you know what, test optional works for us. We don't need the SAT or ACT to make decisions and have a quality, incoming freshman class. One example here was from Michigan's Ross School of Business for their undergraduate program. They found that while the SAT and ACT do have high predictive value, they correlate with the GPA, they found that it's actually more predictive on the lower end of the scale for lower numbers, right? So in other words, a bump up from your ACT score from, let's say, a 22 to 28 would have much higher predictive value than, let's say, for example, someone who has a 30 to a 36. There's not going to be much difference in terms of their predicted freshman year GPA. So they found, well, I mean, since most of our students are going to be in the upper end of the scale, then they could probably use other factors to make those decisions. Right or wrong, that is basically kind of like their decision making. They've decided that, hey, you know what, we're happy with this policy. Of course, you know that the UCs, right, have taken an even step further there and have remained test blind. There's also no foreseeable change for that, right? The UCs and the Cal State campuses in California are most likely going to stay test blind for a very long time, right? So perhaps indefinitely here, okay? Some schools have actually pointed to data that shows that the more recent versions of the SAT or ACT are far less predictive of freshman GPA than it did 20 or even 30 years ago. So there's this movement now saying like, well, I don't know if it really helps that much. The new version of the SATs maybe don't necessarily correlate with or help predict the freshman year GPA. So how useful is it? Okay, now that's obviously up for debate. Some schools think otherwise. That's why there are a lot of schools also shifting towards now including the SAT requirement, which we'll get to here. Okay, so many schools do remain test optional, although as you've heard me talk about in previous seminars, hopefully, that there are now more and more colleges that are requiring SAT or ACT again. So according to fairtest.org, which was one of the main proponents for having test optional policies for many, many years, there's still about 2,080 colleges that remain test optional. So that's still a lot of options if you're not sure whether or not you want to submit a test, right? However, there's now 121 colleges and universities across the country that do require standardized testing again, which is a big change from, let's say, 3 or 4 years ago in the peak of, things like lockdowns when people couldn't really access those tests, right? So a lot of more STEM-centric schools like MIT and Caltech, which outright require it, Purdue say they strongly recommend it, they want to see it, and will only give exceptions to students who couldn't take the test. So it's effectively required, I guess, for Purdue now, okay? As well as over half the Ivy League schools now also require the SAT. So if you want to apply to these schools, you should really consider preparing for the SAT or ACT as part of your overarching strategy, because you don't want to rob yourself of access to any schools down the line that might change their mind and all of a sudden require the SAT again. Okay, so a general rule of thumb that we like people to follow here is if your scores are at least close to the 75th percentile of whatever schools you'll be applying to, you should submit your score. At the very least, your score should be above the 50th percentile, right? So if you're not sure what these are, you can very easily search these online. If you type in like, certain college name like Harvey Mudd, SAT percentile. So you should be able to find that information pretty easily by doing a quick online search, okay? All right, next up, the ACT is undergoing very many changes. So I'll be talking about this shortly here. As you're probably already familiar, the SAT had a major change last year in which they introduced a digital SAT. They effectively phased out the paper version of the SAT, right? To top it off, they also made this digital version of the SAT, what do you call this? They made it computer adaptive, which allowed them to make the test shorter, but it adjusts based on your performance on the first module or the first section, right? However, the ACT did their own version, but here are a couple of key changes, right? So first of all, these changes will kick into effect starting April of 2025, right? So in just a mere, was that 6 months from now, right? So this will definitely impact you if you're a current junior or younger, right? Obviously for seniors now, it's not going to matter. Okay, but for younger classes, this will be something that you want to keep an eye on and start preparing for, hopefully. Okay, so let's first take a look at the key highlights here. Yes, the ACT will have a digital version, but they will also retain the paper version at the same time. So you have a choice as to whether or not you want to take the digital or the paper. It'll be shorter overall. They will be reducing the number of questions. They will be reducing the, I guess, the time per section as well. And one other key change is that the science section, which was oftentimes one of these things where people would opt not to take the ACT because they didn't want to take science, right, is now optional, which should be a welcome change for people who don't really like that science section. Okay, so let's dive deeper into these changes. So first of all, a lot of these were brought about because of responses from, I guess, the ACT's different constituents in their schools, and they've talked to counselors and students based on surveys. And one of the key criticisms is that the ACT is just too long, right? So some key changes overall here is that they've reduced the total number of questions by 44 overall questions. They've also reduced the total amount of time from 195 minutes, which is slightly over 3 hours, to about 125 minutes, which is just a shade over 2 hours. One of the positive changes is that there's now slightly more time per question, and they've also reduced the number of math question answer choices from 5 to 4. So if you had to guess, it's a little easier to guess, I guess, right? Like I said, there's now an optional science section. You could choose to submit it, or you can choose to add it if you think it's going to help your candidacy, right? And you now have a choice between paper and a computerized version. So let's dive deeper into each of these individual changes. Now, for the shorter version of the ACT, let's look at what that looks like. So like I said, 44 fewer overall questions. It's now shorter, down to about 2 hours. With the new time breakdowns, which I'll take a closer look at later on, students will, in effect, end up with about 22% more time per question, which is actually a welcome change, because one of the trickier and more difficult factors with the ACT is students felt like it was challenging to be able to answer all of those questions in such a limited amount of time. So I think it's actually going to be something that many students might find very favorable, because then they will feel less pressured and less stressed out. Okay, and the aforementioned reduction of 5 answer choices to 4 meant that if a student did have to guess, it would be a little bit less stressful, because they can weed out, they can reduce the number of questions, which is actually kind of a smart change, because for the ACT for the longest time, every other section, the English, the reading, the science, only had 4 answer choices. It was only the math that had 5, so it was kind of peculiar, right? So making that aligned makes it easier for people to just have certain key set strategies in terms of when to guess, what to look for with wrong answer choices. I think in terms of training for the ACT, it makes things a little bit more streamlined and uniform, to be honest. Okay, so here's the specific breakdowns if you're ultra curious about how many questions now per section. I did a side-by-side here comparison of each section. So the English section went down from a whopping 75 questions in only 45 minutes to about only 50 questions in 35 minutes. That's a welcome change, right? So you lose about 25 questions, but you only lose about 10 minutes. Very good change, in my opinion, right? Next, for math, it went down from 60 questions to only about 35, and you're only really losing about 10 minutes. Also a really good change, obviously, for math. Reading and science, not as much changed, I guess. You do get a little bit more time, and the number of reading questions has been cut down from 40 to 36, which means it's still 4 passages, but instead of 10 questions per passage, they're only really giving you 9. Okay, so a little bit better. So fewer questions, slightly more time. Okay, science, same number of questions, slightly more time. Okay, but keep in mind the science section is now optional. So what does that mean exactly? Well, this is a welcome change for students who feel like, well, I do like the ACT and I want to give it a try, but the SAT doesn't have science, so therefore I want to take it. So if you think about it, this is a genius marketing decision by the ACT because they were losing so many students who didn't want to take the ACT because the SAT didn't have science, right? So it makes a lot of sense because now it evens the playing field a little bit more. It makes the choice a little bit easier for some students who want to take ACT but are scared off by that science section. So good call. I think that's a smart move on their part. Now, non-STEM students might feel like this is a good thing for them as well, because then they feel like it's fair representation of their abilities if they are not really geared towards STEM or science in particular. So they don't have to take the science section, right? Keep in mind, the SAT itself doesn't have a science section, but there's a sprinkling of some questions that do have some science-based content, but not enough for it to be discreetly called like a science section. And there's not really even a science score overall. So I think that's actually a fair change in this case. It's also important to note, though, that, and this is something directly that the ACT rep told me, right? They really still not sure how colleges will respond to this. It could very well be the case, kind of like it is with test optional right now, that some colleges do decide to say, like, nope, we're not honoring that. We will require you to submit SAT or ACT. This might be the same situation for the ACT science. Some schools, in my opinion, mainly the STEM-focused ones, might actually say, like, I could very easily imagine like an MIT or Caltech basically saying, nope, we will only accept an ACT if you have the science section, because they might feel like that's a more helpful predictive element of having that test, right? So that's definitely something to keep a lookout for. Remember, at this point, it's all speculation. Even the ACT people didn't know, right? So I think this is definitely something that we hope to get some more clarity, and I will certainly update you in future seminars if we do have a little bit more information about whether or not colleges will require it. If there's a broad movement to still require the science section, I think this is something that ACT might sort of just like rescind or go back on. They might end up just making it like a required component again. But if it's only really a small handful of schools, I think they'll probably just keep it and give students the option to go ahead and take the ACT without the science section. Okay. All right. As mentioned earlier, the ACT is now going digital. What does that mean exactly? Well, one of the key things now is that the students have the option to register for either the paper version or the digital version, okay? So for the foreseeable future, ACT said, hey, we have no plans to phase out the paper version, okay? That's one of the key things they want to keep, is that ability for students to still take the paper version if they feel much more confident taking it on paper. Okay, now a key difference though is that the length of both the paper version and the digital version will be identical. And the key reason for this is that unlike the SAT, which is computer adaptive that adjusts based on your performance on the first set, the ACT will just have it as a linear test, right? So it's the same questions that will be offered on the digital computerized version versus the paper version, right? So your preparation will be the same. It is just whichever format of the test you feel more comfortable taking. If you like that freedom to be able to kind of like just mark and annotate on paper, then obviously by all means register for the paper test. If you're just so used to everything being digital because of school and you like the ability to just kind of like flip through on your laptop or computer, and it's just that's the way you're geared, then of course the digital test will be a much better format for you at that point. Okay. So yeah, so definitely, a lot to unpack here, a lot to talk about. In the coming weeks, you will probably start seeing on the ACT website some diagnostics for the digital version. So definitely keep a lookout for that, because that could help you decide whether or not you want to go and try for the digital version as early as April. I would probably say I wouldn't recommend any of our students to be the guinea pigs for the April version of the digital test. It's probably still better to stay on paper, just because there's also a much greater pool or database of previously released ACT tests on paper. So it's probably easier to prepare on paper, right? But if that's something you want to look at down the line, you could consider like a summer testing, or maybe in the fall, and try to see if maybe the digital version would be right for you. Okay, one other part of the conversation in NACAC is the increasing exploration of using performance assessments. So yes, schools want to say test optional because maybe they don't feel like the SAT or ACT would be the right means of assessment for them. But there's been a growing movement towards using other types of assessments. And one category here are what are called performance assessments. as you can see here, these, according to these colleges, are opportunities for students to demonstrate what they know and what they're able to do through actual doing, right? So this is like evidence of your actual work, whether it be like curriculum embedded assessments. This could take the form of like essays or video or PowerPoint you produced in class, some sort of capstone project, like there's a big term paper or research project, or through various portfolios, right? So in the last few years, there's been a growing conversation about like, oh, can we start using these performance assessments as an alternative to traditional standardized testing? So they believe that, hey, this is a chance for you to see like the student's authentic work in action, right, in authentic situations. An example of this, MIT for many years has had what's called their Maker portfolio, which is an optional component as of right now, but students can submit things like videos, like a sample of their code, maybe something to do with like their robotics project or something like that. These are all opportunities for students to showcase other things that you couldn't necessarily get either through grades or through things like test scores. Okay, another example is that Michigan Ross's School of Business does have a requirement to submit what they call an artifact that demonstrates a student ability to put learning into action, right? So they can upload a video, they can upload a website, they can upload like a business plan or something that shows you integrating these things into an actual meaningful project. And it makes sense. There is some merit to this. There are, however, certain kind of things that people are kind of like thinking about, hey, is this going to be necessarily fair? Okay, so one of the key things is that what role will this give them? Well, first of all, it does give them an option, right? So if they're test optional, this could give them yet another way to consider a student's creativity and real world problem solving skills. Okay, so not many schools have made it mandatory. Like as of right now, many of these performance assessments are entirely optional. However, there are some concerns, right? Are these assessments actually going to be fair? Well, that's kind of a tricky question that both admissions and high school counselors brought up, right, in these different sessions that I attended, right? There are questions about like, well, how do you know that this is actually their own work, right? Because if it's something that's produced, how do you know if like a research paper was entirely made by the student? How do you know if a documented video was actually done by the student, right? So it could be something that could be even potentially more skewed towards people who have a lot more resources, right? People used to, for many, many years, complain that SAT or ACT were unfair because people can take test prep courses and use their money to be able to pay for all these resources. What happens now when part of the assessment of going to these schools could include like, oh, submit an actual app or program that you wrote. I mean, who's to know whether or not a student did all of this themselves or whether or not they've hired some professional coder to do this, right? So it does introduce its own set of questions in terms of equity as well. So it remains to be seen how colleges are going to add a little bit more measures to document or make sure that it is indeed the student's authentic work. Okay. Generally speaking, what I advise students to do if they're submitting something like that for MIT is you can actually show a video of you making or doing the thing itself, right? So that could be an easier way to document it. Now, even that isn't foolproof, right? There are still ways for people to fabricate stuff, but it at least gives them more of a sense that this is in fact your own work, right? Especially if maybe in the video you are talking about what you're doing and what you're trying to accomplish. If there's a way for you to talk about it in an interview, I think that could also be really helpful because then you could solidify or reinforce the fact that this is in fact your genuine work. Okay. All right, so our recommendations for these, if you can demonstrate talent and ability by submitting certain performance assessments and artifacts, we do highly recommend that you do so, okay? If you can get a recommendation letter from someone else involved in the said project, that would be really great too, because if let's say, for example, you work on research with a certain professor and the professor talks specifically about your contributions to the lab, then it could be a good way to showing that it is in fact your work and that it's very high level, okay? Like I said, videos are another great way to show that you're in the creative process of creating these actual artifacts. So if you can upload certain videos in your additional information section or through the various schools portals once you've submitted your application, these could be additional ways to reinforce your candidacy and your qualifications to the school itself. Okay, so we're kind of getting close here to wrapping up. One last major thing as it relates to standardized testing has to do with AP exams. All right, so yes, I told you, a lot of changes going on in the world of standardized testing and just exams these days. Even the APs are changing this year. If you're not in the loop, one of the major changes now, like everything else, everything's going digital. Okay, so one of the announcements from a couple of months ago is that all 28 of the AP subject exams will shift to digital forms, not the paper versions that they used to have, starting this upcoming May. So not all of them, though, will be fully digital. About 16 of them will be fully digital, taken entirely on a laptop or tablet, but 12 of them will be what are called hybrid digital, which may include some handwritten responses that are basically given in like a notebook of some sort of like a blue book, like physical blue book, not the blue book app. All right, so the digital subject test, though, the digital component will be on the Blue Book app. So that could be kind of confusing for people that talked about like a notebook Blue Book versus the Blue Book app, right? So just make sure to keep the distinction between the two. All right, so unlike the digital SAT, though, same thing we talked about for the ACT, these AP exams will still be also linear. They will retain the same format and timing as the original paper exams. They will not be computer adaptive, neither will they be shorter. They will remain the same length. However, you just have the option, like it'll be maybe less physically tiring, I guess, to some extent if you're like writing on some of it, but you're just clicking on a laptop or some, right? It remains to be seen. There's, as of yet, there are no like meaningful number of like these sample tests available. So it's probably best at this point, we'd highly recommend just preparing for these the same way you would have the traditional paper exams, because the content is still the same. The units for these AP exams, the curriculum is still the same. So if you do have paper sample tested versions, we highly recommend that you still use those versions to go ahead and practice with. Okay. All right. So that's a lot of testing news, a lot of changes based on what's going on in NACAC. Next is, I do want to talk to you a little bit about, once again, how HS2 can help you with all this. Apart from keeping you up to date with the latest developments, like going to these conferences, HS2 has a tried and true system for its counseling process, right? We go through multiple steps to make sure that students put together their best applications, from developing individualized strategies to having like really thorough discussions about which schools and majors you should consider, to also then talking about like your various activities and resumes, all the way up to the process of polishing and brainstorming and final editing your essays, and then also giving you guidance for things like financial aid, right? This is really how every single year we've managed to get really successful results. As you can see, this year is no different. We've had students getting into a lot of the different top schools, from the Ivies to Ivy plus schools like Stanford, for instance. But once again, you know, we're always just as proud of students who managed to get into schools that they weren't even, you know, able to reach or think they were able to reach, right? So we've had students before who had like multiple C's who were able to get into a mid-tier UC, which I think is a really great accomplishment for them. Okay, so there are many different ways to define success in college applications. Yes, we're very proud of the students who are getting into the top 10, top 15 schools, but we're also equally proud of our students who are getting into schools that they thought were completely out of reach for them, okay, even if those schools aren't necessarily as prestigious. Okay, some other things too. HS2 also has very exclusive programs that we offer for our students. One of which is, if you're looking for something to do for winter break, we do have a partnership with the Harvard Crimson, which is Harvard's school newspaper, for various internship opportunities with the staff of the Crimson. All right, so this is, you know, it's not only for students who are interested in journalism, by the way. If you're interested in other fields like, you know, even the sciences sometimes, because there are different ways to, you know, strengthen your ability to write, especially when you're talking about like things like journaling or sending out reports. So it could be helpful as well for people going to business or finance. There are different options for them as well. So there are a lot of different ways this could be useful, even if you're not necessarily a journalism student per se. Okay. We also have another partnership with UC Riverside as it relates to our certificate program for sports marketing. So a lot of students, especially if you're like an athlete and you have an interest in business, this could be incredibly useful for you. Even if you're not necessarily into sports, but if you want to learn an aspect of marketing, I think for any sort of aspiring business applicants, this could be especially helpful. This could definitely make you look more competitive potentially, because it shows much more broad diversity in terms of your preparation for business. So very useful, definitely something that can help you out. Okay, and last but not least, we do still have our Compassionate Scholars nonprofit organization. So we also help students find volunteer opportunities, and we can help them launch their own nonprofit programs under the umbrella of Compassionate Scholars, So if you wanted to help out in your local community, I think this would be really helpful, especially if you live close by to an HS2 location. But even if you don't, like a lot of these opportunities can be done remotely or online. So it gives you a lot of options, especially if you live in an area where there's not a lot of options for volunteering or community service. Okay. All right. So with that, yeah.